Hey guys, I want to talk to you about something. It's a bit of a question that you'll get from time to time. It's certainly one that I hear. And it's when people from another religion, people who have a different practice and a different belief system, come up to me and say, Paul, don't we really worship the same God? Because after all, we worship whoever that God is that created everything. And I mean, that's who you worship as well, right? You worship the God who created everything. So even though we call him something different, even though we have a different set of practices, we're really worshiping the same thing. And logically, that kind of makes a little bit of sense. However, there is a part of our Bible that really tries to clarify that for us and straighten us out in this area. It's what Messiah called the most important part of the Bible. He said it was the great commandment of the law, and for a good reason. In this passage, our God gives us his identification. He identifies himself with three things: a name, a number, and obedience to his law. This is, of course, Deuteronomy chapter 6, and starting at verse 4, it says, "Hear, O Israel." That's talking to us. That's talking to his people who are called Israel. "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh, our God, is one, and him only shall you serve. And you will love Yahweh, your God, with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your might." So, what does it mean to love him? Loving our God in the Bible refers to obeying him or keeping his commandments. Just like in the New Testament, when you read about fruits, you're reading about fruits of obedience. When you read about works, you're reading about the practice of his commandments or of his law. Again, you're reading about obedience. When Messiah sent his disciples out, at one point they said, how are we going to identify the ones that we're looking for? How are we going to know who's who? How can we sort them out? And he said, you know what? By their fruits you will know them. By their responsiveness and practice of my Father's commandments, you're going to know who these people are. So we have a way of answering that question. Do we worship the same God? Do you and I worship the same God? You know what? Let's put it to the test right now. You've got your God and you call him something, and he has some kind of number and he has some kind of law. So, you know what? Let's take the litmus test right now and see what color the paper turns. I call my God Yahweh. What I'm trying to pronounce are the four Hebrew letters Yod, He, Vav, He, that the prophets of the Old Testament wrote nearly 7,000 times. And, people disagree. Linguists and historians disagree on how that's pronounced. Some people say Jehovah. Some people say Yehovah. Some people say Yahweh, Yahuwah, and there are other things that you can't even imagine that somehow are pronunciations for these four letters. You know what? Nobody up there is judging us on pronunciation. There, I said it. There is no disqualification in the law for somebody's pronunciation, tongue, linguistics. On the contrary, his name will be adored in all nations, in all tongues. He will be worshipped in all tongues. So that's not even really an issue. The question is, do you worship a God who's named Buddha, who's named Jesus, who's named Mohammed, or who's named something that frankly has nothing to do with the four Hebrew letters Yod, He, Vav, He? Is your God's name God? Well, you know what? Right away, that might just be strike one. Because the name of our gods, this isn't just a matter of pronunciation. They have different names. Second question, what is the number of your God? How many is he? Do you worship something that's part of a pantheon of gods? Do you worship multiple different gods? Do you worship a trinity Is your God three gods in one? Or is your God simply the one and only? Is his number simply one, or is it something else? Three in one is not one. Trinity is not one. Multiple, many, that's not one either. So if your God is anything other than one, I'm sorry, that's a second strike between you and me. Then the third thing is, what does your God expect from you as one of his people? What are his demands? What are his expectations? What are his instructions for you on how you're supposed to live and conduct yourself? The laws of my God are found in the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And in those 5 books, he gives commandments on many things, to include how we treat one another and how we worship him. That involves what we eat and don't eat. That involves the holy days that we observe every year. That involves the rest that we take every single week. That involves sacrifices, how we treat employees, how we judge one another, how we rule over one another. It involves basically every aspect of our lives. That is the law of my God. That's his expectation for me. That's what he demands of me, that I practice those laws which are written in those 5 books. So that's what I am marked with. I am marked with that name, that number, and that law. So then the question is that your God as well? I don't care if you pronounce his name a little bit differently. You need to say he's one. There's really no flexibility on that. And when it comes to commandments, you know what? There's even a little bit of grace there. Maybe you haven't learned as much as I have, or maybe I haven't learned as much as you. Maybe there are some things that one of us isn't obeying just because we haven't learned it yet. Also, maybe we have a different interpretation of something. You know, there is one day of the year that my God commands us to afflict our souls. Some of us believe that that means fasting. Others believe it means something else. What do you believe? What do I believe? This is one of those things that comes down to interpretation, and there's considerable evidence on both sides of this argument. And in the end, really, personally, I don't care. What my question is to the best of your understanding, to the best of your interpretation of the wording and the evidence provided, is your conscience clean in observance of this commandment? Do you do your very best to keep this commandment at the right time of the year and in the right way? Even if my interpretation differs from yours a little bit, guess what? You're still my brother or my sister as far as this goes. I'm not building walls between brethren. I'm not trying to divide Israel over something as trivial as an interpretation, where there are 2 people who have the will to obey and who are doing their best to keep the commandments. If there's not fellowship, somebody is wrong. There should be unity in the house, and this is really the dividing line between who's in the house and who's out of the house. Do we worship the same God? Yes or no? Does he have the same name and the same number and the same laws or expectations? If the answer is yes, then we have fellowship between us, and there is no way to treat one another other than love. That's the commandment. In fact, that's half of the law right there. Half of the law teaches us how to love our God. The other half directs us on how to love one another. And if we're tearing each other apart and putting up walls between ourselves on matters of interpretation, then heaven help us. We're in trouble. So when somebody asks you, don't we worship the same God? There's the test. What's your God's name? What's your God's number? And what are your God's laws?